Great, thank you for having me. This is going to be an interesting talk because it is going to be way less technical than the ones we've seen so far, which is a bit of a role reversal for me. I usually get stuck giving technical talks to non-technical audiences, so giving a non-technical talk to a technical audience is going to be, well, we'll see how it works out. So today's talk is Open Problems in DAOs with an emphasis on why you should care, and this project has been facilitated by Metagov. It involves an extremely large number of collaborators. I was asked to come and give this talk today because Josh Tan, who was the first author of our paper, had to go to DWeb Camp and attend to some other, hopefully related, decentralized systems business. But I wanted to emphasize the breadth of the background of the authors on this paper because we have computer scientists, mathematicians, lawyers, ethnographers, people who work in political science, as well as on economic systems. And really, it's been a really pleasure to collaborate with this many great folks with this many great backgrounds. The paper itself, this is a rough overview of the outline. You can find it on arXiv. We made an effort to sort of sketch out the territory across computer science, economics, ethics, law, organizational science, political science, and philosophy. And to be totally honest with you, that wasn't everything that we bumped into, and worse yet, it feels a lot like this. So thinking about DAOs, it's interesting, right? You have to deal with the question of what is an organization before you can worry about the questions of autonomy and decentralization. And in the particular case of DAOs, we're exploring the ways in which new technologies create new capabilities and the way those new capabilities are leveraged by groups of people towards their collective ends. And so in an effort to build out a map to go survey the field, we wrote this paper and invite everyone to fill in the gaps, identify bigger gaps, and where possible, contribute to expanding that field. Now, I can't really do justice to everything that's in this paper in a short talk, but I am going to start by trying to motivate for you why you should care about DAOs, when I think most of the focus of this conference has been on technical capabilities and meaningful improvements to those technical capabilities. The fact is that DAOs, or in various ways technically constituted organizations, are being used to attack some pretty major issues, and that includes with your colleagues at your foundations, at your companies. And some of the main focus areas that we highlighted in the paper are sustaining open source software, which in a sense is the ability to create and maintain the technical infrastructure itself, but also other technical infrastructures that require funding to produce forms of value that are not strictly monetary. We've seen a growth in interest in democratic governance of artificial intelligence, or just more generally the democratic governance of computational spaces. When we start gathering data, when we start leveraging it to create both public and private benefits, a bunch of questions arise about who owns what, under what circumstances they have the authority to make decisions about who can use those tools or derive monetary benefits from them. And finally, regenerative finance. There's been a growing number of organizations focused on how these new technologies can change essentially the political economy that drives sustainability projects. I think it's a recurring theme that our market mechanisms don't actually discover the kinds of value that we want in the world, and we've identified that organizations are taking blockchain technologies, decentralized networks, and smart contracts into this venue, despite headwinds where in many sectors it's viewed as the exact opposite of that as a result of the origins of proof of work. I'm going to take a step back and talk briefly about me so I can share my particular part of this research or my work on DAOs. And that's going to take one step away from the broader everyone in this author group's expertise. I'm an electrical and systems engineer. I got my PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2014. My day job is as the founder and chief engineer of a small private R&D firm called BlockScience. Blocks as in modular components, although we do quite a bit of work in the Web3 space, so no complaints about the reference there. I'm also a board member and a research director at Metagov, which is a laboratory for digital governance, and this complements the technical role where I'm working with community members and projects to understand and explore the ways in which these technologies affect governance. I'm going to recommend that anybody who's interested in technical systems impacts on society more broadly and interdisciplinary work have a look at this map. It's from Berkeley. It's the Cyber Physical Systems Concept Map. It's clickable. All the things are defined. I think the first time I referenced this as applicable to blockchains was in a 2019 paper with Sherman Voshemger, but I come back to it over and over and over again, which is a cyber-physical system is a collection of mechanisms that is controlled and or monitored by computer-based algorithms tightly integrated with the internet and its users. Given that and that definition and this concept map, I find it hard to look at blockchain-based systems through any other lens. I realize that it's important to take an interdisciplinary view, but the reason I like this particular domain is because it's already entangled in our existing infrastructures, and it brings into it questions of economics and governance through the provision and maintenance of infrastructures where there are humans in the loop, the systems are distributed, intelligent, real-time, and so on. And so that's really not a main focus of our paper, but it's something that I wanted to provide as grounding for my interest and my thoughts on DAOs specifically. So from the paper, we draw on the most canonical definition of DAOs, at least in the Web3 space, which is Hassan and De Felipe. DAOs are organizations governed by a smart contract, typically deployed on a blockchain that autonomously enforces rules for interaction amongst the members. However, in our paper, we acknowledge that DAOs also belong to a larger class of digitally constituted organizations, organizations governed through computational artifacts such as software, hardware, and protocols. And so in this view, we're interested in more than just organizations that are grounded in a set of rules that are executed and validated on chain, but we're interested in the organizations themselves. I'd like to share this meme from my friend Eric Alston. He gave a talk at the Ostrom workshop on litigating the ledger, civil liability for DAO controllers, and he introduced his talk with this meme, where we see that there are a lot of things that just don't make the smell test. Like some people might say, hey, this is governed by a smart contract, but what are the rules actually? And do they make any sense? Do they do they actually serve the purpose that was the stated purpose of the group? Is it actually just underwriting a scam or a rug pull? I don't know. Is it a DAO if it's governed by a smart contract, but the thing it's doing is not coordinating the activity of a decentralized group, autonomous from an external authority? I'm not really sure. So drawing on a piece of work that I did with Eric and several other co-authors, we laid out the definition of a constitution, at least insofar as it's relevant to digitally constituting organizations. So the function of a constitution is to delineate the boundaries of a particular organization or entity, entrenching elements of its composition relative to that organization's regular process of decision-making. So this is like secondary rules, rules about how rules are made. This can include things like changing parameters or upgrading contracts if you happen to use upgradable contracts. But it also is part of what holds that boundary against external context, legal, social, economic, and environmental forces. For the most part, we look at DAOs in terms of their robustness, their ability to be unperturbed by external forces. But we've seen in practice that they are, in fact, affected by those forces, because as long as you can influence the decisions of actors or operators within the organization, you can affect the organization. So this constitution operates to reinforce the coherence of that entity. It gives it persistent identity in the face of both internal and external pressures, and evolve through its interactions with both its members and its environments, again, while retaining its identity. And I think the key here for me is that in order for something to be a thing, it has to have some notion of persistent identity over time, and that persistent identity over time is generally given to it through something constituted, something that changes more slowly than the other elements. So it can have behaviors, processes, decisions, events, proposals, outcomes debates, arguments, etc., but its identity, it persists. And I think that also invites us to think about the circumstances when identity breaks down, like when a DAO goes through a fork. And what would that even mean? Well, you generally have to fork the code, but you also have deviations in the set of commitments and participation and involvement of the participants. So more memes. Another reason why you should care, especially since this is a pretty technical audience, is as Gabe Shapiro put it in the MetaLex white paper, the age of lawyers is over, the time of the coders has come. Now, I'd probably soften that a little bit, but I like the direction we're going here. Thinking about this from an infrastructure standpoint, we have these organizations, these decentralized networks, DAOs, protocol guilds, Borgs, etc. Whatever the organizations, the activities that we are organizing and the groups of people participating in those activities, they are using, operating, monitor, maintaining, and governing infrastructures. And those infrastructures are in turn enabling, facilitating, standardizing, automating, decentralizing the activities that they undertake. And this is actually a natural feedback loop. We don't really have institutions without any infrastructures, because if they had no infrastructures, they wouldn't be constituted in the sense that they had persistent identity. They have patterns of behavior that are entrenched in tools, in rules, in processes, etc. And getting standardization and scaling generally comes with building infrastructure. And conversely, we don't really have any infrastructures without institutions, because there needs to be somebody to actually maintain that infrastructure. Sure, if it works once, but if you need it to happen time and time again to produce that persistent identity, then you're going to have some pattern of behavior that actually uses, operates, monitors, maintains, and governs that infrastructure. So I prefer this version of the meme. So not so much code as law as algorithms as policy, and first wrote about this with another one of the co-authors from our survey paper, Kelsey Nabin, in 2020. Drawing on other collaborative work with Kelsey, we pushed on this notion of a constitutional archetype where we strike a balance between mutability and immutability, and that the key here is to make sure that the set of things that one can do to modify the organization or the organization's core rules, its constitution, is small. You don't want it to be none, because then you have no adaptive capacity, and that there are certain kinds of emergent threats you won't be able to deal with. But on the other hand, you don't want to be particularly mutable, because you need that constancy, that trust, that identity. And in this case, the trust is, you could say, a kind of confidence that the rules won't be violated, or a procedural legitimacy. You still need to have enough room within the organization's decision-making capacity to pursue some sort of shared purpose, even if that purpose is just the continued maintenance of the infrastructure that is being used. So one more meme from this group. So we have the humans are in the DAO. This is from Amber Case's The Human Side of DAOs podcast, and for reference, Amber is also a research director at Metagov and one of the founders of DAO, which is a DAO tooling DAO that operates primarily in the Cosmos ecosystem. But the emphasis here is on the fact that we can't separate the humans from organizations, that they are part of the organization. In fact, they animate it in the sense that they provide the impetus to do something, to pursue a purpose, as it were. And so adapting from another earlier work that's cited in our paper, we have this articulation of an institution, or potentially a DAO, insofar as the technical infrastructure is sufficient to qualify under your preferred definition of DAO. We have humans acting underneath the rules. So we've got tools. Those tools both provide and enforce rules about what actions can be taken and what happens when you take them. And those rules themselves are akin to this constitution. And if you want to make amendments to that underlying rule set, rather than simply apply that rule set, then we would consider this governance. And that governance can be directly over the technical infrastructure, but it can also be influencing the norms that affect which decisions agents take within a particular context. I prefer using MEV as an example of a circumstance where norms have emerged, because particularly in the Ethereum context, where whether or not a sequence of transactions is valid ultimately determines whether or not it can be accepted as a block, doesn't actually change the fact that there are things that people consider kind of inappropriate. And we've seen the emergence of things like flashbots to essentially standardize and set behaviors that are more acceptable. We've seen changes in the way that research is directed towards things like PBS as a result. And prior to actually affecting any direct change on a network, or even instead of affecting a direct change on a network, you can see the emergence of new tools, new practices, and new behaviors within the context of a technically or digitally constituted system. So this sort of brief exploration of DAOs is meant to get you at least interested. It also implicates the topics explored in the Open Problems in DAOs paper. I personally contributed mostly to the computer science and economics sections, given my particular background, but it was really compelling to get to see that work interwoven with the expertise from researchers and faculty in law, organizational science, and political science. This particular paper is meant as an invitation to start a new area of inquiry, again, more with the kind of what I would call the traditional engineering vibe, where we have to build out an interdisciplinary set of skills that operationalize the technology that we're developing in real-world contexts, which means making pragmatic assumptions about the world in which those technologies are being deployed and trying to, in essence, make it easier and more practical for those tools to be used by people who are building organizations. And again, there's a lot of open questions here, and there are a lot more open questions that haven't been asked. And so our preference is for people to reach out to us. This link is a Notion site as opposed to the canonical link, which is on Archive, because this link provides access to how to contribute. And we would really like it if people both helped build out the number of fields and the questions being asked, as well as beginning to fill in and write papers trying to answer some of these questions, because we think that is the natural trajectory of bringing this technology effectively to the world. So thank you very much. So my goal was to do questions as a way of getting to all the content. So if people want to jump into any of the specific topics, I can also answer questions there. But there was no way to cover everything, so this seemed like the right approach.
Are there any questions? Oh, there are a few.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I was recently reading a lot of papers about centralization issues in DAOs and how most people tend to vote, the rich just get the highest say. Can you speak to that? Can you speak to those issues?
Sure, yes. All right, so we're going to do a lightning talk on that. So first off, I think there's a fundamental issue with thinking of DAOs in terms of voting, right? Voting is a process that's used to render a decision. And by over-indexing on voting, the decision-making process, rather than on broader notions of steering or guiding an organization, a lot gets lost. So first off, the voting turnouts do tend to be biased in token-based systems because only a relatively small number of people feel as though they can meaningfully affect the outcome. I think there's a relative lack of use of forums and deliberative processes. Although those forums exist, they're often used more to essentially manufacture consent in the Chomsky sense. And that in practice, the movements that we should be looking at are how to better treat the attention of the participants within a DAO as a resource, not necessarily maximizing for participation, but also not necessarily departing from that, rather moving to a set of metrics that are more outcome-oriented with respect to whether DAO members feel as though their interests are being adequately represented, but that's more of a check on the behavior of the DAO rather than a direct metric on participation. And it would be interesting to see how people might implement alternative models that shifted away from trying to get everyone involved in every decision and shifted towards making updates to processes as a function of whether people felt their interests were being represented by the decisions the DAO was rendering.
Great talk. Look forward to digging into the paper. Thank you for sharing the Notion link as well. How do you see in the next few years the evolution of DAOs? In particular, if we see a bull market and prices going up and bringing a lot of people back into the blockchain landscape, what are some objectives or some measurable outcomes that you'd like to see in order to make some tangible progress and continue to evolve?
Yeah, I think tangible metrics. I think I would like to really see more interoperability as opposed to scale. So I don't know that a bull market will help this very much because it tends to make individual organizations balloon, brings in a lot of money, and they try to take on bigger projects that they're maybe not really that well equipped to manage. And so my take is that what makes DAOs so exciting is that they can be fundamentally more localized, more specific. And so they can be smaller, they can be capitalized and orchestrated by smaller groups of people who are aligned in what they're doing. But in order to manage more complex tasks, you would look to DAOs collaborating with each other. And there's a citation in the larger paper to a short bit of work I did a few years ago on DAO to DAO protocols. And I think that there's more emerging there. We start to see it through contracts referencing other contracts. We start to see it through organizations collaborating directly and sharing funds in streaming pools, sort of splits types contracts. And the infrastructure is starting to bubble up, but what I'd really like to see is empirical evidence through the data from those contract patterns that the organizations themselves are staying smaller and more specialized, but webbing together into groups that can drive larger outcomes. Just trying to accomplish really big outcomes from these large foundations running these blockchain networks right now. I mean, folks like Optimism and Arbitrum are working really hard to build out grant programs, but the shapes that these programs are taking are increasingly similar to legacy government institutions out of necessity because they're trying to appropriate public funds and they're trying to deliver it legitimately to actors and monitor and validate outcomes. And it moves pretty far away from the sort of underlying open source development pattern. And I think there's some stuff in the middle. And I think DAOs are going to help us find that stuff in the middle.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the talk. And continuing what you were saying about voting, I think there's additional hardships when it comes to DAOs that are implemented via smart contracts and code, in the sense that it's both technically complicated for end users to understand and comprehend, and also the incentives for voting and participation are kind of misaligned a lot of the time. And I feel like the science behind it is like when you look at literature, it's mostly like negative results for deciding things that work. So I was wondering if you have anything in mind for that.
Yeah, so I think, and I started to allude to this before, I think that we just haven't scoped the problem right. Like we're asking what kind of voting we should be doing, not what things should we be voting for, who should be engaged in that decision-making process, what other processes go alongside those voting processes to ensure that we're even considering the right topics. And I have a forthcoming paper with Nathan Schneider, Ronan Tamari, and Kelsey Nabin on attention economies, in particular with case studies around DAOs. And the thing that we highlighted is that the real resource here is attention, and that also starts to invite some of the HCI questions. You're like, well, if I make it really difficult for you to understand the decision-making context, if I demand that you participate in a decision, hopefully in an informed way on a regular basis, I'm not necessarily efficiently using that attention resource. And while we want to maintain representativeness, participatory systems, we want to make sure these systems are as permissionless as possible. At the end of the day, if we don't rescope the question to be a little bit more about making the return on attention for the DAO participants something that they're willing to do, then I don't think we're going to get the kind of growth in the DAO sector that I was hoping for in the previous response.
Also, if decisions were made in natural language and then the translation to code was made via a trusted party or something like that.
Yeah, so I've been doing some experimentation with Metagov around co-governing some digital infrastructure, including RAG chatbots, and that's largely been off-chain, right? It doesn't make sense to try to regulate those configurations on-chain, but there's this need for this large community of researchers. I think I mentioned Metagov is a kind of skunkworks community, like lots of people with governance backgrounds, but with different experiences, researchers, hackers, founders, et cetera. And the group that's there wants to play with these kinds of questions, and our KOI project, Knowledge Organization Infrastructure, is actually about governing like what data is there, how it was collected, who can use it, which kinds of microservices are incorporated into a local mesh, and even which services can call each other is on the table for the iterations on this tooling. And my feeling is that this kinds of knowledge organization infrastructure is going to be critical for decentralized organizations to lower attention costs, but it's a few clicks into the future. I would imagine needing to get to a point where those patterns were sufficiently standardized, to some extent verifiable, and we would have to maintain on-chain records of things like the wiring and permissioning rules. I had some chats about this with Jake Hartnell, who was one of the founders of DAO as well, and one of the co-authors of this paper about storing KOI configurations in the sort of struct inside of a DAO. But that would, at this point, be a hackathon project, right? It's not really the current state of the art.
Time for one final question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. So, if you were to set up a DAO yourself or design a DAO, what would be some objectives and maybe even measurable objectives that you would optimize for?
Yeah, so for me, like viability, kind of survivability is the ultimate objective. I think one thing that's been interesting about DAOs is they've been pretty short-lived in some ways because they have a balloon of attention often correlated with money, and then a diffusion of that attention as it bleeds out into other places. So the metrics that I would imagine focusing on are actually long-livedness, and that would mean probably spending a lot less money. It would probably mean not even necessarily raising as much money, but emphasizing the type of participation that's invited and the correspondence of that participation to delivered benefits, not necessarily financial. That hinges on experience working on SourceCred. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this project. It was funded largely by Protocol Labs a couple years ago, and it involved the instrumentation of a bunch of Git repos and forums and measurement of contribution scores. And those scores ended up becoming the driver of compensation, and the organization lasted for actually quite a few years. The code base lives on and people do still use it. So I look to that example most readily as something that was probing in the direction that I would want to go. But my feeling, and this relates to the kind of constitutionality here, is that that community sort of turned over in people, which is fine, but the later groups of people didn't have the same level of comfort with the infrastructure, and so they weren't able to adapt it to meet their own needs. So the breakdown potentially could be attributed to the loss of the sense of autonomy, because it felt like the algorithms were controlling the contributors rather than the contributors actually controlling the algorithms, and I understand that as a kind of dance. And if you're interested in that work, there's a long-form ethnography of SourceCred by one of the other co-authors from BlockScience, Ellie Rennie.
Interesting, thanks.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for this session, but please feel free to talk to the speaker afterwards. Let's thank the speaker again.